Hello, everyone. Today we're going to talk about four different individuals, and I've lumped them together and called them the psychologists, even though the first two individuals we're going to talk about weren't really psychologists or didn't even really belong in that category, but I've called them the psychologists because you have two of the individuals. One started the American School of Psychology, the other one was considered the father of experimental psychology, and psychology was considered born in his laboratory. And the first two individuals we're going to talk about kind of were the precursors. They were the prototypes of what would go on to be the psychoanalysts, and then the medical psychologists, and then the clinical psychologists. And we'll get into that. So we're going to talk about Franz Mesmer, the father of hypnosis. We're going to talk about the first experimental psychologist, Wilhelm Wundt. And we're going to talk about the psychologist, William James. He was the founder of the American School of Psychology as well as the philosophy of pragmatism, which was predicated on how practical and useful certain things are. He was also a functionalist in a sense, so he wasn't just about analyzing behavior, but actually wondered why people behaved the way they did and what utility it had, which kind of fostered into that philosophy of pragmatism. So let's get into Franz Mesmer. So he was around 1734 to 1815, so he was an 18th and 19th century individual. He was a physician, and he thought that people had these magnetic fields around them, and anytime the magnetic field got a little wonky, they would have what's called disorders of the mind and what we call mental disorders. And if you think about the time that he was around, this was around the time that most of the people with mental illnesses or madness or lunacy would be sent to jails. They'd be in the poor houses, the alms houses is what they called them, the poor farms. So they were really thrown out of society in a sense. And toward the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century is when the attitude of basically warehousing folks in places like what they called lunatic asylums or mental asylums, which were giant hospitals where they were to be, where people kind of lived out their days because we didn't really, when I say we, I mean humanity, people at that time didn't really have any idea what to do with them or how to treat them or how to cure them or how to treat mental disorders. So they just kind of housed them in these large asylums, and we'll get into that. In fact, well, might as well just talk about it now. Is I'm looking at putting a course together on the history of the state hospital or the lunatic asylum, mental health hospital system in and of itself, from the madness in the ancient world all the way to where we're at today. So we can really talk about the mental hospitals and the large asylums. I think that there might be an interest among you guys that actually come and watch these videos and might actually find that interesting to learn about. I don't know. Won't know until I put the first lecture together, put it up here on YouTube, and see who decides they want to watch that or learn about that sort of thing. But going back to Mesmer, so yeah, he believed that people had these magnetic fields, and whenever would get out of alignment, then they would start to have hysterical neuroses, which is what they called mental disorders back in the day. Hysteria was kind of like a psychosomatic illness, and it's characterized by overdramatic behaviors as well as symptoms that can't be better explained. And so what Mesmer would do is he would use magnets and intense staring to treat the disorders of the mind, thinking that he could realign their magnetic fields. Now, in the notes here, see, this thing's mirrored, so I have to remember if I want to point to what would be your left, I have to point to my right. So, pointing here where it says, hysterical neurosis, which is now somatization disorder. So, one of the disorders that you could think of that is functional neurological symptom disorder. And what that is it's a disorder with somatic symptoms that are complained about with no physical source. So I can give you an example. I worked with a fella while I worked at Central State Hospital in the admissions building who had functional neurological symptom disorder, mixed symptoms, and one of the symptoms he complained about was his inability to eliminate urine and the need for a Foley catheter. And I guess there was no discernible physical explanation for why this person couldn't eliminate urine, but they think there might have been something psychologically going on there. But there was also borderline personality disorder and the behaviors associated with cluster B pathology, and that leads to, let's say, entanglement with law enforcement, charges being pressed, and the need for competency restoration, because that's kind of what I did in the admissions unit, was work on teaching people about the court system so that way they could go on to court. But that's kind of what we mean by somatization disorder, or hysterical neurosis, which was basically psychosomatic bodily symptoms that were being complained about with no real physical cause that we could discern. And so what Mesmer would do is he would stare intently, try to induce a hypnotic state, use these magnets to realign their magnetic field around them. It's kind of like aligning their chakras. So you could say that Mesmer was attempting to modernize for the time, trying to modernize shamanic medicine man healing, that kind of thing. It's almost akin to like Reiki in a sense, and I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. Sometimes I talk over myself or stumble over my words and mispronounce some things. So let's try not to pay too much attention to that. But the idea is that, I guess, taking the ancient healing patterns of the past and trying to modernize them with the theory of magnetic fields and the use of magnets to realign them so that way he could try to cure somebody of their mental disorder or mental disease or disorder of the mind. That was what he was trying to do. So that's why I would say he was probably, the prototype for the first clinicians or psychoanalysts or psychotherapists. He was actively trying to treat people with mental disorders, whereas more often than not, they would find themselves confined in the mental hospitals at the time. So I keep saying the mental hospitals, so I really think I'm going to move forward with trying to put together a lecture series on the history of the mental hospitals, because I think they're kind of cool, and I think you'll find them to be kind of interesting as well. So more about Mesmer here. He became a sensation in Vienna after he claimed that he had cured this lady of her neurosis. And in 1777, as he was making these claims, his claims tend to offend many influential doctors around Vienna, especially when he made a claim that he had partially cured her of her blindness. Because blindness at the time, there was no cure for that, and so that was a hell of a claim to make. And so he claimed that she could see in his presence because the blindness was psychosomatic. So I guess the best way we can try to hypothesize what happened today is he was able to induce a hypnotic state, and under hypnotic suggestion, she was able to act as if she could see even though she was blind, which led him to make that claim. In 1778, this lady's parents kind of stopped treatment, and the doctors of Vienna all came together and kind of denounced him as a charlatan, which means fraud, fake. I think we call those folks a snake oil salesman today. And so because of this, he fled to Paris, France, and then he started experimenting with other ways to kind of, I guess, make what he was doing more scientific. So what he tried to do was he designed this tub made out of oak. He filled it with water and these iron filings to make this a magnetic fluid that he would have people lay in, and he would try to treat the different ailments. Many of them probably somatic complaints, bodily symptoms probably associated with neurosis at the time, or like I said, what we call functional neurological symptom disorder. It used to be called conversion disorder once upon a time. Cool little side note about that. But he would try to treat, different people with different complaints in this magnetic soup of his and in these oaken tubs. So much so that he was able to notice that through touch, gestures, and long, intense looks, right? So this is kind of the beginning stages of what would be called hypnotherapy. Mesmer believed that he could influence the magnetism of his patients. And so this mesmerism, it became like the it treatment in Paris. It was like the popular cool thing to do. It's kind of like every every, I guess, what would you say, every time and period in our contemporary history, we've always had the big it thing. So, like, psychoanalysis was the big it treatment when Freud was running the psychoanalytic what was it, the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society there. Um, and then after psychoanalysis fell out of favor, let's see, I guess cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy are considered like the it treatments today. They're evidence-based practices. You can measure treatment outcomes, and so that's what makes them so popular today, and everything else kind of out of date. Well, even when it comes to like obesity and diabetes, the Stacker 2s and the Trim Spas were the big diet treatments back in the 90s to early 2000s. I mean, why we would call it the it treatment at the time is, well, you had Anna Nicole Smith who was doing these Trim Spa commercials that would come on like late at night. I can remember that damn infomercials when I'd be watching these movies late at night because, when you're an adolescent, you think it's cool to stay up late and watch all these weird ass movies because the parents are asleep, so they can't come in and tell you, hey, you can't watch this, or hey, what are you watching, and all of that. And let's see, Ozempic is the big it treatment for diabetes and obesity. Now people are taking it so they can lose weight, cure their diabetes, and get off of the insulin injections. So we've gone through periods where we've had these it treatments that become very, very popular. Now, because it was very popular, it caught the attention of the faculty of the University of Paris, and they were not impressed with Mesmer and his claims and his methodologies at all. In fact, they also came out and they called him a fake and a fraud, and they challenged him to prove that what he was doing was true, and of course he counter-challenged them to investigate his treatments and test them to make sure that they were valid. And so challenge was accepted by a commission of doctors, academics, and even Benjamin Franklin, who was the acting ambassador to France at the time, all gathered to carefully study his methods. And they found that his magnetic fluid was non-existent, it was bunk, and that his treatment was just imagination and openness to suggestion. And so his treatment and its popularity kind of waned over time, and he himself ended up leaving France and lived in seclusion for the rest of his life in Switzerland. Which brings us to the second individual who was trying to treat people with disorders of the mind, and his name is Auguste LeBault. And Auguste here was a French physician, and he discarded all of the metaphysical and mystical things associated with mesmerism and just kept to what could be objectively observed, and that he could use hypnotic suggestion to cure patients of the symptoms that they were complaining of. So he was really the real father of hypnotherapy in a sense, and his methods were taught to the people that ended up, I forget his name, but I think it was was it Otto Rank? I think it was Otto Rank, but I could be wrong about that, so don't quote me on it, but we'll definitely talk about him when we get to the Freud lecture and the psychoanalysts. But the point being is that Auguste LeBeau's his hypnotic treatments would become the basis for hypnosis and hypnotherapy, which is what Freud would begin messing around with when he stumbled onto psychoanalytic methodology. Because he started off as a hypnotherapist or using hypnotic suggestion while trying to treat patients with disorders of the mind. And as we'll find out in the Freud lecture, one of the ladies that Freud was treating basically said, hey, why don't you just let me talk and stop interrupting me, in which he decided to listen until she said something of interest that he would actually ask questions about, which led to the first known psychoanalytic treatment. And so by 1860, this is 30 years prior to Freud's psychoanalytic breakthrough, his treatments had vindicated part of Mesmer's claims, which were the therapeutic ones, which meant that people who were open to hypnotic suggestion could easily be treated for their somatic bodily symptom complaints. So now we get to the father of experimental psychology, Mr. Wilhelm Wundt here. So psychology was considered to be born in December of 1879 at the University of Leipzig. This was the first time that they had recorded experiments to measure reaction times. So a group of physiologists and physicians, Wundt, Max Frederick, and Stanley Hall, all set up an experiment to measure the time that would it take between the time a ball was dropped and a telegraph key was hit using a chronoscope to measure the duration of the apperception, meaning they were measuring the time from the time somebody heard a ball fall and they tapped the telegraph key. And so that measurement of time is, well, that's reaction time in a sense. And because this laboratory or institute that was created there at the University of Leipzig, that's why he's considered the founder of modern psychology, is because of his lab. Because the idea today is that psychology is a science. Some would call it a soft science. Some would say, well, psychology is both a soft science and a hard science. It just depends on what type of psychology you're studying. So the psychometricians consider themselves to be more hard scientists because they use empirical methods and statistical analyses to measure what it is they're measuring for their research. So psychometricians would be like the personality psychologists, people that study IQ, and you have the behaviorists who consider themselves to be more hard scientists because they're studying objective behaviors rather than, say, the subjective worldview of a person's phenomenology or their experience of the world as they experience it. And we'll get into that when we get into the existentialists and the humanists like Carl Rogers and Irvin Yalom and Rollo May and the rest of the existential psychologists. But for now, we're just going to look at how experimental psychology was set up to be like the first hard science for psychology. So Wundt personally supervised over 200 dissertations across Europe and America, which means between the US and Europe, 200 dissertations. So people, basically, he supervised and made sure that they knew what they were talking about when they were becoming doctors of physiology or doctors of medicine. And I think Freud was a neurologist, so even neurology had a role to play in the birthing of what psychology would be. And Wilhelm Wundt wrote many articles and books that would establish psychology as a science. In fact, Wundt was the first scientist to be called a psychologist rather than just a physicist or a philosopher with an interest in psychology. So other people were calling him a psychologist. And so what Wundt did was he restored the study of conscious mental processes to psychology, rejecting introspection in favor of the scientific approach to psychological phenomena, or psychology without a soul, as one would put it. So Wundt easily could be pointed out as one of the first people to influence what would become the behaviorist movement, which we'll talk about after we get done with Freud, Jung, and the psychoanalyst. Sorry, I've said psychoanalysis. Yeah, just ignore me and my terrible habit of being, well, easily able to stumble over words and mispronounce things. So give me some grace on that. You know, recording these things aren't exactly easy when you're trying to do it all in one take and you're trying to be authentic. I could, do it slide by slide by slide, but it just seems a little robotic when you're doing that. I'm not into that robotic thing, and so I think mistakes and all kind of, well, we're humans after all, even if we're on the internet. Well, I think I went a little too far, or I went forward a little too far. I'm not sure. But while other scientists had used experimental means to measure certain mental processes and responses, it was Wundt who fully developed the methods to carry out psychological research. So he was coming up with the methodology, he was coming up with the step-by-step instructions on how to carry out psychological experiments and psychological research. And the researchers in Wundt's laboratory, they didn't study the wide array of subjects that psychologists do today. So back then, there wasn't social psychologists, personality psychologists, clinical psychologists, child and developmental psychologists, neuropsychologists. Psychology instead was a very small yet broad umbrella, but not an umbrella wide enough for the array of all the different facets of psychology that we have today. Now, Wundt's favorite method was what's called trained introspection, wherein only those who were trained could observe their own sensations, mental images, and emotional reactions, but they had to make 10,000 practice observations of other people before they could even actively start observing their own. Thought that was pretty interesting and wanted to throw that in there. Which now brings us to the American psychologist himself, William James, philosopher and psychologist. In America, Wundt's ideas were opposed by this psychological school known as functionalism. Right? What's the function? What's the use? What's the practical application of things? And so, rather than trying to analyze and describe behaviors, William James kind of wanted to know the why and the how, rather than what they are. So, from 1842 to 1910, that was his lifespan. He attended many schools in his youth. He even went to schools in the US, England, France, Switzerland, and Germany. And after many failed attempts at chemistry and medicine at Harvard, he decided to study under the physiologist Helmholtz. And under his tutelage, he became conversant in the new psychology. He returned to Harvard as a professor of philosophy, but changed his title to professor of psychology in 1889. So this is why he's considered the first real psychologist, is because he came up with the title of professor of psychology. Like Wundt, he did experiments in a laboratory, though he absolutely hated it. He had his students whirl frogs around to explore the functions of the inner ear, and then he did the same thing to deaf mutes. And let's talk about that for a second, because there's a lot to unpack in that, right? So people with hearing disabilities, especially if they're severe, have trouble with speech. So many of them who couldn't hear also couldn't speak. Now, we don't call them deaf mutes today. We might say they're hearing impaired, but that's the more politically correct term, for lack of better words. So we don't do that. And the second thing is that those experiments back then wouldn't cut the mustard today because of ethical considerations. So you could do things with people that you can't do with them today because of ethical restraints. And we can talk about ethics in a different course, but they didn't have the ethics boards and committees to make sure that the psychological research didn't harm anyone. So I don't think you can just whirl around hearing impaired people and then whirl around a bunch of frogs and just see what happens. But did come to find out, due to the damage of the inner ear in the hearing impaired, they're less sensitive to dizziness and vertigo compared to the hearing intact counterparts. That was a mouthful, and I'm glad I was able to say that without stumbling over it. Now, functionalism is the study of the complex processes of the mind as they evolve for adaptation, for life preservation. So again, what's the function of the behavior? What's the use and the utility of it? What's the practicality of it, right? And this is all under pragmatism. In fact, I think it's fair to make the argument that functionalism was the precursor to what we call pragmatism. And you do find pragmatism in an approach in therapy where you say, okay, well, how useful is this, or how is this working out for you? That's one of the approaches I used as a therapist, and reality therapy, which I'll talk about when I get to the behaviorist lecture, because right after Skinner, when we started putting the thinking back into things, there's a gap between the pure behaviorists and the cognitive behaviorists, where you could have behavior that's chosen, but there's still a section of personal responsibility, and that's Glasser. And choice theory / reality therapy, again, the theory is that the behavior is chosen, and yet there's personal responsibility to it. But the idea, it's like, okay, so in reality therapy, if a client says, okay, well, I have this problem, the first thing I say is, okay, well, what are you doing to solve your problem? So that's the first thing. It's like, okay, you want to solve the problem, what are you doing? And then I might ask, how is that working out for you? So now we're looking at how useful is the things that you're doing to get you what you want. How is that working out for you? And we can, hopefully the client and I can come together and we can say, okay, well, perhaps this isn't working as well as you'd hoped. And then we can come up with something else that we can do to try to get you what you want. So that's the idea of using pragmatism in therapy is, okay, well, if what you're doing has no practical utility for you, what else could you be doing that would be more practical, that would get you what you want? And then, from a cognitive behavioral standpoint, then you could say, okay, well, try doing that once or twice this week. And when I meet with you next week, let's talk about how this worked out for you. So we can evaluate the changes in behavior, right? And of course, with my more personality disorder clients that I worked with, one of my favorite things to do was, to be like, okay, well, if what you're doing isn't working for you and you don't seem to be willing to change the behavior, then the question is, okay, well, what should we do? Should you change what you want to match what you're doing, or do you need to change what you're doing to match what you want? Because those are some very important things to consider, especially if your life isn't working out for you so well. So that's kind of how functionalism and pragmatism kind of still is used in psychology and especially in clinical psychology and professional counseling today. So, okay, the nature of the mind, dualism of perspective, right? So what this means is the external objects and our knowledge of them and the material world and the sets of states in relation to them, right? So, what's the best way of thinking about this? Well, this notepad. Okay, we know it's a notepad. We can see it's a notepad. What's it for? Okay, well, one is it stores knowledge, right? You write down what you know, you write things down, and it becomes like an external hard drive of the things that you're thinking about or things that you need to know or remember. You can also keep it on your desk or hold some papers down. So it's a paperweight and it's an external storage things for the things that you need to remember, the things you're thinking about. So that would be like the dual nature of the notebook, right? So it's part of the material, right? And it's your state of mind according to it, or the way that you kind of, I guess it's utility, it's function. It functions two different ways. You can use it as a thing to write your thoughts in, and you can use it as a bloody paperweight if you want to. He also thought about stream of thought as consciousness was the process for adapting behavior to the circumstances. So your stream of thought is how do you adapt yourself to the things that are going on around you. William James also believed that the self was a distinct principle and was integral to the common sense of mankind, so that what is common across humanity is the self. So very separate from Jung's idea of the self, which we'll get into when we get into Jungian psychology, when we talk about Jung, and he's part of the psychoanalytic movement. But Jung also kind of broke away from Freud, and Jungian psychoanalysis is also called analytical psychology, and Jung's idea of the self is very different from James's version of the self. James also looked at the will, and James's idea of the will was that it was a supply of information from experience that drove a person to a desired end. So the idea of the will from James's point of view is that all the information that we have about the world is what we use to motivate us toward a certain end in the world. So it's just all of our memories and all the information that we've taken up from the world versus, say, Adler. I can't remember. Alfred Adler. So he was another one of Freud's psychoanalytic supporters, and the will, according to Adler, the will to power was basically, it was the human will and ability to, what would you say, have discipline on oneself. Because he has this inferiority superior complex thing, and the idea of superiority was one's master of their own will and their own discipline over themselves to motivate themselves toward a desired goal versus the sum of your memories and information that you've taken on about the world. So James and Adler had different ways of thinking about the will, just like James and Jung had different ideas on the self. And it's so bloody interesting now that I think about it that William James was thinking about the things that the future psychoanalysts would be thinking about. Granted, the definitions are still a little different. So you can see why William James is considered to be the psychologist, because he was coming up with these concepts and thinking about things that the psychoanalysts would also be thinking about and use similar terms with different definitions. I guess one question we could ask, and this is something I'd have to look into, is how aware of the psychoanalyst was William James, and how aware of William James were the psychoanalysts? Because they're all part of the psychology umbrella, and they're using the same terms, but they have these different ways of thinking about that. So that's a really interesting question to think about. And then James's idea of the unconscious. In some parts, he thought the total of mind was conscious, but in other areas, he recognized that there were processes that we didn't consciously attend to. So when I worked, again, as a clinician at the hospital, and I would try to talk about the unconscious, because I'm psychoanalytically minded in some ways, in a lot of ways, actually. And so when I would try to explain the unconscious, I would say, okay, let's say you're a client and I'm talking about your unconscious motivations or the unconscious things. It's kind of like you're cooking at a stovetop, right? You're attending to the boiling water, you're attending to the meat that's cooking on the stove. You might be somewhat aware of the things on the side, like your spices. Maybe you have your spatula. Maybe you've got some things over here. You're not really paying that much attention to them, but they're still in your field of vision, so you're aware of them. But behind you on the kitchen island, you might have your plates, your cups, your utensils. That's all in the unconscious because it's totally behind you. So you're not even paying attention to it. It's not in your field of vision. You might know it's there, but you're not consciously attending to it because it's back there, and you're more focused. Hopefully, you're more focused on what the hell you're cooking, because God knows you don't want a grease fire in the kitchen, because that would be kind of bad. But that's kind of how I've tried to explain the unconscious to people. It's probably not the best analogy in the world, but it's the best that I could come up with at the time, and it's one that can make sense, especially if you're not a psychology student and we're sitting here talking about the things in the behind you that you're not really paying attention to that might have some influence on what's going on with you. So that's how I've tried to, what would you say? That's my attempt to explain the unconscious to people that aren't necessarily psychology students. So hopefully that analogy works for you, because I don't have anything better at the time right now. I might come up with something better in the future, I hope. So, William James and emotion. So James's theory of emotion is his most well-known and heavily researched even today. I've got this book by a psychologist by the name of Lisa Feldman Barrett called How Emotions Are Made, and she even talks about William James and the James Lange theory of emotion, which is the next slide, which I'll talk about. So the emotions we feel are not what cause our bodily symptoms, such as fast heart rate or sweaty palms, or let's say bodily sensations of emotions. That the physiological changes are the nervous system reacting to our perceptions of the things that we call emotions. And so, I'll talk a bit about that here in a second. So Carl Lang, he was a Danish physiologist, and he worked on the same theory of emotion at roughly the same time. And what's cool about William James is he didn't sit there and say, "Oh, well, you're stealing my work." He actually acknowledged it, and they never really collaborated. But because he acknowledged it, that's why it's called the James-Lange theory in textbooks today. Now, there's many ways that this theory is faulty, and I'll explain that. So, a Harvard psychologist by the name of Walter Cannon found that different emotions shared similar physiological manifestations. Therefore, you could call it the psychophysiology of emotional manifestations are not significant enough to differentiate between the different emotions. So, here's the best way I can think about it. So, I'm going to bring in emotion and motivation into this. So, we can talk about emotion and motivation psychology in this, right? So, okay. Positive emotions are predicated on approach. It's like something makes you feel enthusiastic, like say you have a goal that you're working toward. Let's say you have a goal to lose 10 pounds in a month. And so you might be motivated to work out every day. And as you're stepping on the scale every week, you notice you're losing, 2 pounds, maybe 3 pounds, and you're like, hell yeah, you feel really good. You're enthused. So you're now motivated to approach the gym and to work out even harder so that way you can continue losing that 10 pounds a month. So that positive emotion is going to make you feel really good, and it's going to motivate you to do, um, it's going to motivate you to approach the gym and continue working out. Now, you're not going to be heavily sweaty. So your skin conductance with positive emotion, you're not going to see much in the way of, say, an accelerated heart rate. You're not going to be looking at increased skin conductance, and but your emotional state is going to be one of enthusiasm and positive emotion because you're motivated to approach the thing that makes you feel really good, which is you're losing the weight that you want to lose. Now, fear, on the other hand, right? Fear is a negative emotion. So psychophysiologically, fear is going to increase your heart rate. It's going to cause increased skin conductance, which means your palms are going to be sweaty. You're primed for action, and it's negative emotion because you're motivated to withdraw from the external stimulus. So the thing that makes you afraid, like if you're afraid of spiders, you're going to run away from the bloody spider. So you're primed for action to move away from that which you're afraid of. It's like a big scary dog barking and growling at you, and you think you're going to get eaten by the dog. You're going to run away from the dog. So your heart rate's going to be increased, your fast twitch muscles are going to be engaged, you're going to have increased skin conductance, and you're going to get the hell away from the big scary dog. That's fear in a nutshell. Then there's anger. Anger's both positive and negative at the same time, and you might say, how the hell can emotion be positive and negative at the same time? Which is a really good question. The answer to that is, well, anger, like fear, increased skin conductance, increased heart rate, fast twitch muscles primed for action. So, like fear, you're having those psychophysiological responses. Anger is predicated on approach, not withdrawal, because anger is motivated to remove a barrier between individual and their goal. So, how can we make this make sense? Let's say your goal is to break the school record for the high jump. And you keep failing, you keep knocking the bar off every time you try to jump over the damn thing, so your skin conductance is going to increase, you're going to have increased sweatiness, your heart rate's going to get faster, your fast twitch muscles are going to be activated much quicker, and through practice and perseverance and getting pissed off, you're actually going to be able to jump over the bar that's going to be the measurement for the high jump. So you've removed the barrier between you and your goal, which is getting over the bar for the high jump. You've approached the said thing, but yet the psychophysiological response is way different. So that's kind of what we mean by the physiological manifestations or the psychophysiology of the emotional responses to these different things. And so if the psychophysiology isn't how you differentiate between the emotions, what do you do? Well, this is where we look at people's different facial expressions, and this is where you see the expressions of emotions is on people's faces. And then you have wonderful emotions like disgust. That's where you see people crank up their nose and purse their mouths, and it's predicated on disease avoidance. So the facial expressions associated with disgust are motivated by the behavioral immune system, which is ways to avoid pathogens and to avoid sickness, because, well, you don't want to die from getting a disease that would be horrible enough to kill you. So that's kind of where that comes into play. So, last slide, conclusion. So there were three founders of a new science in psychology. There was Mesmer, the hapless man with the ability to self-promote himself, and his haphazard treatments led to what we now call hypnosis, hypnotic suggestion, hypnotherapy, which was the precursor to psychoanalysis, which was the precursor to the enterprise of psychotherapy. or the therapeutic enterprise, which we'll talk about as we get into the psychoanalysts, the existentialists, and the humanists, as well as the cognitive behaviorists, because cognitive behavioral therapy is based on behavior modification, changing ways of thinking about things, and paying attention to emotional responses, because your thinking, your feeling, and your acting are all tightly interlinked, even though we try to act like there are three separate things, but these three things happen at the same time. There was Wilhelm Wundt, considered the father of experimental psychology due to his laboratory work, which set the standards for research for what psychologists do today in the psychology labs all across the US and Europe and the universities. And then you have William James, the functionalist, who was interested in the how and why rather than just the what things are. And he influenced research into emotions, how we empirically study emotion and motivation psychology, as well as, I didn't add it into these slides. These slides are 6 years old. Only this is the second time I've ever done this lecture. But he was also the founder of the School of Pragmatism, which is an American philosophy, which is how useful or practical is a certain set of beliefs or actions in relationship to adapting to the world outside of you. So I guess I could use this time to kind of explain how we look at utility or how practical something is. So one of the other things that James was interested in was the idea of the utility of belief. Now, this particular example came out of a discussion that Jordan Peterson had with Sam Harris with Brett Weinstein as the moderator. And you can find the conversations on YouTube under the channel Pangburn Philosophy. But they talked about, the idea of the belief that porcupines can throw their quills. Now, obviously, that's not true. Porcupines can't just throw their quills at people. That's not how that works. So why do people believe that? Well, that's because if you get near a porcupine and you are unfortunate enough to get stuck by their quills, the quills detach themselves from the porcupine and you have porcupine quills stuck in your hands, arms, legs, or anywhere else that you're unfortunate enough to happen upon the porcupine. And the porcupine quills are extremely painful. So people develop this belief that porcupines can throw their quills. Now, obviously, that's objectively false, but it could be metaphorically true, or at least true enough. And that's what William James and Pragmatism talk about, is something being true enough. It's useful. Why is it useful if you believe the false idea that porcupines can throw their quills? Well, you'll probably stay the hell away from a porcupine. You won't have to worry about getting stung by their damn quills, and you're better off for it. And that's the idea. What would you say? That's a very rudimentary explanation of the utility of or let me say it. Let me try that one again. It's a rudimentary explanation of pragmatism and how you can apply it. Something like that. And so that's kind of where William James kind of influenced philosophy with pragmatism, is what's the function and the utility and the practicality of something. How's it working out for you? Well, if you're staying away from porcupines, I'd say it's working out pretty damn well for you. And this brings us to the last slide, which is the references. Only three references for this whole lecture. And I managed to make it go for about 45 minutes this time around instead of just 30. So the next lecture coming up will be the psychoanalyst, and I'll start working on the history of the mental hospital lectures. I don't even know what the hell we're going to call it as a class yet, but I'll figure it out. Thank you for coming and watching this. Subscribe, leave a comment, and see you when we talk about the psychoanalysts, and we're going to start with Jung.